Welcome to Unraveled Tales, where the drama of neighborhood feuds and HOA madness unfolds before your eyes. In today's story, we dive into a suburban battleground where what started as a simple backyard barbecue quickly spiraled into an all-out war against a tyrannical HOA and its self-appointed enforcer, Karen. I never imagined that joining an HOA could lead to one of the most dramatic chapters of my life. I moved into the Evergreens community with dreams of a peaceful suburban life, a place where neat lawns, friendly neighbors, and quiet streets painted the picture of the American dream. Little did I know that my experience here would turn into an epic saga of bureaucracy, backstabbing, and the kind of neighborhood drama that you'd normally only read about on Reddit threads. It all started on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning. I was sipping my coffee on my front porch when I noticed an unusual flurry of activity. Several of my neighbors were congregated near the community bulletin board, their faces etched with worry and discontent. Being naturally curious and admittedly a bit nosy, I strolled over to see what all the fuss was about. The board was plastered with memos and flyers about upcoming HOA meetings and, more importantly, a recent surge in code violations. Apparently, a series of complaints had been filed regarding unauthorized modifications to home exteriors, landscaping issues, and even one claim of a dog barking too loudly. The atmosphere was charged, and whispers of Karen started to circulate. I'd heard about Karen before, the archetype of a neighbor who takes it upon herself to police every minor detail, armed with a clipboard and an intolerance for anything less than perfection. At first I thought it was all overblown. After all, I'd only just arrived in the neighborhood, and I wasn't aware of any scandals. But over the next few weeks it became clear that the HOA was far more authoritarian than I'd imagined. The board, headed by a stern woman named Mrs. Winifred Hargrove, wielded its power with an iron fist. They would send out official warnings for what many of us considered petty infractions. One day, my neighbor Tom was cited for leaving his recycling bin out just an hour too long after pickup. Another time, a family across the street received a notice for having mismatched flower pots, an offense that seemed trivial at best. The tension escalated rapidly, and soon it wasn't just about rules anymore. Personal vendettas began to surface. I remember one particularly chaotic meeting where voices were raised, accusations hurled, and the phrase, "We need to take a stand," echoed in the community hall. It was during this meeting that I first encountered the infamous Karen in all her glory, Ms. Karen Baxter, a middle-aged woman known for her meticulous garden and her even more meticulous enforcement of HOA rules. Karen had been one of the loudest proponents of stricter regulations, and it was rumored that she'd even threatened legal action against those who failed to comply with her version of neighborhood perfection. At the meeting, she stood up nearly shaking with indignation and delivered a scathing monologue about the deterioration of community standards. I watched, half amused and half horrified, as she outlined her plan to report any and every deviation from the norm. It wasn't long before she became the unofficial enforcer of the HOA's edicts, a role that she seemed to relish. The situation came to a head one fateful summer when I decided to host a casual backyard barbecue for a few friends and neighbors. I'd spent weeks preparing, ordering enough food to share with anyone who might drop by, and setting up a string of fairy lights that I thought added a warm, inviting touch to my garden. I'd always believed that a little community bonding could help ease the tension in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, I was about to learn that in Evergreens, even a friendly get-together could ignite a powder keg of drama. It was mid-afternoon when I noticed a few residents walking by, giving me disapproving glances. I thought nothing of it until the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Karen Baxter standing there, arms crossed and face contorted into an expression of sheer indignation. "Excuse me, but I must ask, "Are you aware that your barbecue grill is emitting what appears to be a continuous plume of smoke?" she demanded in a tone that brooked no argument. I was taken aback. "Oh, that's just my grill, Karen. I've invited a few neighbors over for a barbecue," I explained, trying to keep my tone friendly and conciliatory. "A barbecue in the middle of the day with an open flame? Do you have any idea how this violates the community's fire safety regulations?" she snapped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had read the HOA guidelines before moving in, and nowhere did they specify that a simple grill was a fire hazard in broad daylight. Before I could respond, she continued, "I must inform the HOA immediately. You're endangering not only yourself, but everyone in this community." And with that, she marched off, leaving me dumbfounded and more than a little irritated. That evening, as the sun set and the barbecue continued in spite of the interruption, I heard a knock on my door. It was Mr. Jenkins, a kindly retiree who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. His eyes, however, were filled with worry. "I just got a call from the HOA," he said in a trembling voice. "They're saying that your event is causing a disturbance and could lead to fines or even a shutdown. We need to talk about this." Over the next few days, the situation only worsened. The HOA sent out an official notice demanding that I cease all public gatherings in my backyard, citing vague clauses that spoke of public nuisances. I felt as if I had been targeted for no reason other than the simple fact that I dared to host a community event. What started as an innocent barbecue had now become a full-blown neighborhood scandal. I decided to take a stand. I organized a meeting with several like-minded residents who were fed up with the HOA's overreach. We gathered in my living room, a motley crew of frustrated homeowners ready to reclaim our community from the iron grip of bureaucracy. At that meeting, I listened to stories of others who had been harassed by the HOA for what seemed like every minor infraction imaginable. There was Lisa, who had been penalized for having a decorative gnome in her front yard that the board deemed inappropriate, and there was also Mark, who had been warned for painting his front door a color that wasn't in harmony with the neighborhood palette. As we discussed our grievances, it became clear that we were not alone. The majority of us had simply wanted a pleasant, safe environment to live in, but the overzealous enforcement of arbitrary rules was pushing the community into a state of constant fear and tension. The sense of unity was being replaced by suspicion and resentment. We decided that the best course of action was to call for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA board. I was elected to lead a committee to draft a petition that demanded more transparency, fairness, and respect for our personal liberties. Our goal wasn't to dismantle the HOA entirely. After all, some structure was necessary to maintain community standards, but to ensure that it served the residents rather than ruled them with an autocratic hand. In the following weeks, we gathered signatures, attended heated board meetings, and even organized a few peaceful protests outside the HOA office. Karen Baxter, of course, became our most ardent opponent. Every time we tried to present our case, she would appear, clipboard in hand, and berate us for what she called anarchy. The drama escalated to a point where every encounter with her felt like a battle of wills. One particularly memorable confrontation occurred during a board meeting that was packed to the rafters. The air was thick with tension as I took the floor to address the board. I spoke passionately about the need for balance between maintaining order and allowing residents the freedom to enjoy their homes. I could see a few nods of agreement among the audience, but I also saw Karen's eyes narrowing in disapproval. "Are you suggesting that rules and regulations are unnecessary in a community?" she interjected, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Without rules, we descend into chaos. I have seen firsthand the benefits of strict oversight," I responded, trying to keep my cool. "I'm not arguing against rules entirely, Karen. I'm advocating for reason, fairness, and the recognition that we are a community of individuals with unique tastes and lifestyles. A one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work, and frankly, it's stifling. The room erupted into murmurs of agreement, but Karen wasn't finished. You speak of individual freedom, yet you ignore the consequences of unregulated behavior. I worry that if we let our guard down, we'll all suffer for it. The meeting devolved into a cacophony of accusations and counter-accusations. It was one of those surreal moments where the sanctity of the community meeting turned into an impromptu stage for personal vendettas. After the meeting, I spent a sleepless night contemplating how a community I once admired had become a battleground. The next day, I received an unexpected call from Mrs. Hargrove herself. In a measured tone, she requested a private meeting at the HOA office. I agreed, albeit with trepidation, knowing that this was likely the prelude to a final showdown. During our meeting, Mrs. Hargrove laid out the board's perspective. She cited the increasing number of complaints and the need to preserve the aesthetic and safety standards that originally defined evergreens. We're not against community gatherings or individuality, she explained, but we must ensure that our community remains orderly and that the rules are upheld for everyone's benefit. I countered by pointing out that the rules were often vague and open to interpretation, leading to arbitrary enforcement. I gave examples, like the grilling incident, and stressed that the spirit of community was being eroded by a rigid and punitive approach. The conversation was tense but civil. In the end, Mrs. Hargrove agreed to review the guidelines, promising that the board would consider more flexible policies. It felt like a small victory, but I knew the battle was far from over. Over the next few months, our petition gathered momentum, and the community began to rally behind our cause. More residents stepped forward to share their stories, and even some of the board members who had been previously silent started to question the stringent rules. We held town hall meetings, circulated newsletters, and even set up an online forum where residents could voice their concerns anonymously. Karen, however, remained a constant thorn in our side. Every time we tried to organize an event or propose a change, she was there to argue that we were undermining the very fabric of our community. I recall one incident where we organized a small art fair in the community park. It was meant to celebrate local talent and bring residents together. As the event got underway, Karen showed up with a megaphone, lecturing everyone on the supposed dangers of public art installations. Her relentless tirade almost forced us to call the police to maintain order. The tipping point came during the annual HOA Summer Gala, a fancy, overly formal affair that had always been more about social posturing than genuine community engagement. This year, the gala was billed as an opportunity for the board to showcase their accomplishments and for residents to enjoy a night of elegance. I attended with a mix of skepticism and hope, thinking maybe this would be a chance for the board to ease up on their rigid policies. As the night progressed, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained. Karen was on her usual high horse, critiquing every decoration, every dish, and even the choice of music. I couldn't help but notice the rolling eyes and whispered comments among other attendees. Midway through the event, during a dinner speech by one of the board members, a fire alarm suddenly blared through the hall. Chaos erupted as guests scrambled for the exits. It later turned out that the alarm had been accidentally triggered by a malfunctioning smoke machine in the decoration display, a mistake that might have been laughable if it weren't so perilously timed with the escalating tensions. In the aftermath of the gala, the community was left reeling. The board faced intense criticism, and several residents demanded accountability. I found myself at the center of the storm, not because I had orchestrated the chaos, but because I had been one of its most vocal critics. It wasn't long before the issue reached the local press. Suddenly, what had started as a neighborhood dispute had transformed into a media spectacle with headlines proclaiming "Evergreens in Crisis, HOA or Dictatorship," and "Karen Strikes Again when Perfection Becomes Paranoia." Facing mounting pressure, the board was forced to call an emergency meeting, This time the stakes were higher. The community turnout was unprecedented. It seemed that every resident in Evergreens had come to voice their concerns. The meeting was a whirlwind of impassioned speeches, heated debates, and a clear sense that the old order was being challenged. I spoke up, my voice steady but resolute, reiterating that we needed a balance between structure and freedom. I proposed a new committee, one that included a diverse range of residents, to work on revising the guidelines and ensuring that enforcement was fair and transparent. To my relief, the proposal was met with applause. Even some of the board members who had been staunch supporters of the strict regime nodded in agreement. It felt like the community was finally taking a stand for itself. Karen Baxter, however, wasn't ready to concede. In a final act of defiance, she stormed out of the meeting, declaring that if the board couldn't maintain order, then perhaps Evergreens wasn't the community she believed it to be. In the weeks that followed, the newly formed committee worked tirelessly. We held listening sessions, consulted legal experts, and drafted a revised set of guidelines that emphasized clarity, fairness, and community engagement. It wasn't easy. The process was fraught with setbacks, compromises, and more than a few exasperated sighs, but gradually, change began to take root. The revised guidelines were eventually approved in a vote that saw a significant majority in favor of a more balanced approach to community management. Looking back now, I can't help but marvel at how a seemingly mundane suburban neighborhood transformed into a battleground of wills and ideologies. What started as minor disagreements over grill smoke and garden gnomes escalated into a full-fledged fight for the soul of our community. I learned that behind every HOA regulation is a mix of good intentions and human fallibility, and that the price of perfection can sometimes be the suppression of individuality. The whole experience taught me invaluable lessons about community, compromise, and the importance of standing up for what you believe in, even when the opposition seems insurmountable. I've come to realize that every neighborhood has its share of characters, from the passionate idealists to the stubborn traditionalists. And while conflict is inevitable, it's how we resolve it that defines us as a community. Today, the Evergreens community is not without its quirks. There are still disagreements, and yes, even Karen Baxter occasionally pops up with her relentless critiques. But there's also a newfound sense of cooperation and understanding among the residents. We've learned to navigate our differences with more empathy and a willingness to compromise. The HOA is still in place, but its role has shifted from that of an authoritarian overseer to a facilitator of community dialogue. As I sit on my porch these days, watching the sunset and listening to the quiet hum of everyday life, I can't help but feel a sense of pride in how far we've come. The battles we fought weren't just about rules or aesthetics. They were about reclaiming our right to live freely, to enjoy our homes, and to be part of a community that values both order and individuality. And while the scars of those turbulent months remain, they serve as a reminder that change is possible when a group of determined individuals comes together for a common cause. So, if you ever find yourself embroiled in a neighborhood drama that feels too absurd to be true, just remember, every community has its battles, and every battle is an opportunity to learn, grow, and ultimately build something better together. After all, even in the midst of chaos, there's always hope for a brighter, more understanding tomorrow,